distinguished guests, dear colleagues, alumni, and friends of CEIBS. So it's a pleasure and honor to be here. So the title of my speech is China's Economic Outlook. That is assigned by the organizer because I'm an economist. But I want to warn you that an economist is a trained professional to guess wrong about the economy. So it is very easy to make economic forecast, but it is very hard, even impossible, to get it right. So, it may be, why? Because the economy just fluctuates. So it's almost like a random walk, not just China and also US and any other country. So the economy fluctuates, it can go either way, so that makes it hard to predict. But it may be counterintuitive, but it is the fact that it is actually much easier to make long-term prediction. Okay, why is that? Let's look at this. So we economists like to use this GDP per capita growth, because GDP per capita growth measures the growth of standard of living. So you can see that over the past 40 years, actually it's from 1979 to 2019. 1979 actually was the first year of Chinese economic reform after the third plenum. And then 2019 was the year just before COVID. So you can see that the American per capita GDP grew from about like $30,000 US, measured in 2010 dollars, to about more than $60,000. But China started from a very low level of 300 to a level now of about 9,000 2010 US dollars. So you can see the average growth rate for the US over the past 40 years was 1.66%. For China was 8.42. Now, I bet no one in this room or any economist would predict a lower growth rate for China than the US in the next 10 to 20 years. Who would bet against me? Maybe no one. So we have very high confidence about that. But actually, in the end, what matters most is the long term, not the short term. Of course, you worry about this year, but actually, you worry more about the future, right? So we actually should worry more about the long term. But of course, here we can see that China has grown so much faster than the US. That's not surprising to any one of us, right? Because China started from a very low basis. Now, of course, for that very reason, China should have grown faster than Europe, faster than Japan. But then if you look at all those three economies, so you should be surprised to find that over the past 40 years, such a long time, the average per capita GDP growth rate for the US, EU, and Japan are identical. Are you surprised to find out about that? Identical. What about Australia? Let me tell you, 1.68. Okay, so all the politics, all the news, all the hypes, and all the crises didn't make much of a difference to the long-term growth rate of those advanced economies. So I'm sure you can now predict for the next 20 years, these economies, these advanced economies, their growth rate will be less than 2% a year and greater than 1% a year. We have very high confidence about that. But then what about the Chinese economy? Can we predict that China will continue to grow at 8% a year? Of course, the answer is no. Why is that? Now let's look at some other countries. So 8% is very unusual. Now India, of course, because India started also from a very low level. So India has grown very fast. Of course, compared to the advanced economies. If you are an Indian citizen, you won't be very happy about this. Why? Because you want to compare with China. You wonder why India has not grown as fast as China has, right? What about South Korea? South Korea started at the middle income level. Now it's approaching the European level. It is an advanced economy. So now you might think that, okay, of course it's easier for a country that has a relatively low income to grow faster than advanced economies, right? That's what your conjecture would be. But there's no rule like that. If you actually look at the whole world, you just find the opposite. When you look at Africa, sub-Saharan Africa as a continent, there are a few exceptions, of course, but for most of the continent, their per capita GDP has barely grown at all over the past 40 years. Then in the Middle East and North Africa, so the situation is very similar. And for Latin America and the Caribbean region, their average growth rate has been below 1%. That is lower than the US. In other words, the Mexican economy has grown more slowly than the American economy or the Canadian economy. And the Brazilian economy has grown more slowly than the American economy, measured by the per capita GDP growth rate. So you can see that all developed economies are alike. But all developing economies are developing in their own ways, right? All developed economies have exactly the same growth rates over a long term. But developing economies can develop very differently. So the question is, can China continue to grow faster than most other countries? Let's say at around 5% a year over the next 10 to 20 years. There's no guarantee of that. We've seen that a lot of developing countries do not grow very fast. A fast growth rate, even at 5% rate, is very high. So can China do that? That's a very important question for the future. Not for this year. This year, of course, I'm sure that unless there's some kind of new black swan event, China will for sure grow faster than 5%. If it's anything less than 5%, then we have to ask why is that, right? Given a low base from last year. So, but we wonder whether China can continue to grow at 5% a year over the next 20 years. If that's the case, then it's going to have a huge impact on all of us. Now, to answer that question, then we have to answer these two questions. One question is, what has driven China's rapid long-term growth in per capita GDP over the past 4 decades? And we also have to ask, why has China's growth rate slowed down so sharply in recent years? So only after we answer those two questions, we can understand the Chinese economy and we can make some reasonable forecast for the future. So, well, to answer those two questions, I actually wrote a book about it. That's the book that Xiaoming just mentioned, Catching Up to America. Can China catch up to America? In what sense, right? So in this book, that was published just slightly over a year ago by Cambridge University Press. That was peer-reviewed by anonymous referees. Now, in that book, I tried to debunk some popular explanations of China's economic rise. So people, of course, would attribute China's rise, rapid growth to reform and opening up, and globalization, cheap labor, demographic dividend, industrial policy, political stability, of course. But you have to remember, none of these things is unique to China. Of course, all these factors are important, of course, for China's growth. But they are not unique to China. It's not just China. These explanations may explain why China has grown faster after reform than before reform, or China has done better than Korea, or North Korea, that is, or Cuba. That's it. It cannot explain why China has grown much faster than the Philippines, or Nigeria, or Ethiopia, or Indonesia, for that matter, right? So we have to look for differentiating factors that distinguish China's economic growth from that of other countries, especially other developing countries, because it's not surprising for China to grow faster than Europe or the United States. But it is another matter whether China can grow faster than Nigeria or Indonesia. There's no reason why China should have done that, right? So to answer that question, we actually need to distinguish between two concepts. One is the long-term economic growth, the other is short-term economic fluctuation. Because there's a widespread confusion about what actually drives China's economic growth due to the failure to make this distinction. Well, in economics, we actually define economic growth, as the sustained rise in the capacity to supply economic goods and services. So by definition, it's a long-term concept. And it looks at the economy from the supply side, the production side, not from the demand side. And the economic fluctuation then refers to the ups and downs of the short-term GDP growth rates. So why do we only look, for the long term, why do we only look at the production side, supply side? Just think about this. The reason why Switzerland is so much richer than Jamaica is not because the Swiss people like to consume more. It's because the Swiss people can produce more at the per capita level. Okay? So it's the production that leads to consumption, right? Now, if that's the case, then this is long-term growth. So over a long term, so the economy, most economies will grow, okay, at, of course, various rates. And then this is economic fluctuation. So the GDP growth rates fluctuate over time. It varies every year. So obviously, the determinants of long-term growth should be very different from the determinants of economic fluctuation, because those are two different things, right? So what determines long-term economic growth? The standard economics tells us this: there are only 3 direct drivers of economic growth. No any other reason. That is investment, which is the accumulation of physical capital. Education, the accumulation of human capital. And technological progress, the accumulation of technologies. That's it. Not natural resources, because natural resources cannot grow. Not population, because we are looking at the per capita GDP. GDP per person, okay? So investment, education, technological progress are the 3 drivers of economic growth. Not consumption, not exports. So the commonly referred 3 drivers of economic growth are misplaced. They are the 3 demand factors that impact on the growth rates, on the short-term growth rates of GDPs. Okay? So consumption, investment, exports. So investments, of course, have a contribution to long-term growth, but not consumption, not exports. Just think about this. If consumption can make a country grow fast, then there will be no poor country at all. Just spend money. Just consume. Everybody knows how to consume. But it is hard not to consume when you have money. But the Chinese people can do that. And the Swedish people also can do that. So, in fact, if you actually look at the data, so the very reason why Zimbabwe, Jamaica, Greece have had very low long-term economic growth over the past 40 years, less than 1%. Not because they don't want to consume, they consume the super majority of their income. Not because they don't want to export, they export a lot, given the size of their economy. Let's look at Jamaica. Jamaica exports 41% of their products. So it is a very open economy. So, again, consumption and exports per se don't make a country grow fast. Otherwise, Mexico would have grown much faster than the United States. Okay? Now, so what drives economic growth? Of course, investment. So the reason why China, Japan, and Korea have had much higher growth rates because they have invested a lot more than other countries. Right? So in order to understand China's long-term economic growth, we have to look at the 3 factors of investment, education, and technological progress, to see whether China still has any comparative strength in those three areas. So if you look at the investment, so the very reason why China can grow the fastest in the world is because China has the highest investment rate among all countries in the world. And Korea and Singapore and India also invest quite heavily in their economies. Then, of course, if that's the case, then you say, why other countries don't just follow suit? Just learn from China, just invest more in their economies. But to invest, you have to have money. You have to finance the investment. So how do you finance your investment for a country? First, it comes from domestic savings. If you don't have enough money, then you borrow from other countries, foreign debt. Now, in the case of China and Korea and Singapore, we all save more than we invest. So that's why we have trade surplus. We cannot utilize all our goods and services. We have something extra for other countries. But the reason why India cannot grow faster than China, because India's savings rate is so much lower than China. India is already investing more than they save. So that's why they grow relatively fast, but they cannot grow as fast as China because their savings rate constrains their investment rate. Now, for most countries, in order to grow, you have to have savings. But you cannot just rely on foreign countries for your own investment, especially not for a very long time, no matter whether you are a big economy or small economy. So how do you get the money to invest? Of course, you have to consume more or consume less. So the Chinese, the Koreans, the Singaporeans, we all consume much less than other countries, as well as the Swiss people. Okay? So the first strength of the Chinese economy is our high savings and a high investment rate. Okay? So this is not due to any particular government policy. Now, you might think, oh, the Chinese people only save, they don't consume. That's just, the real story is just the opposite. If you look at the growth, China has had the highest consumption growth among all countries in the world. So China's per capita consumption growth rate over the past 40 years, before COVID, was 4.4% a year. Just ask all the multinational companies who do consumers' goods to ask where their growth comes from. Now, China, of course, has a very low consumption rate, but China's consumption growth is the highest. Now, of course, Greece has a very high consumption rate, but their growth of consumption is only 1.1%. So how come is that? Because China has the highest growth of income. Consumption growth is the result of income growth, not the other way around. Okay? It's the income growth that generates consumption growth. Not consumption growth drives the income growth in the long run. Okay? So that's why consumption growth and income growth are basically the same for most countries, especially large countries. But of course, for some countries like Greece, their growth of consumption is higher than their growth of income. That is, of course, not sustainable. For the Singaporeans, they save even more than the Chinese because they are also Chinese as well, only richer. Okay? So the Singaporeans, their income growth is faster than their consumption growth. So that's why they save and save so they have more wealth overseas. Okay, that's the story. Now, okay, that's the first driver of economic growth. That is the investment, high savings and high investment. That's the strength of the Chinese economy, not the weakness. So the second, of course, is education. So we are not talking about the quantitative education. We are not talking about the government's investment in education. China, in terms of government investment in education, in terms of the quantitative public education, China does not stand out. China is not exceptional. It's just very, very average, even among developing countries. What sets China apart is the quality of its education. And it's the quality of basic education. You all know what I'm talking about. It's the secondary school education. It's the primary school of education, right? So according to a well-known economist, Hanushek from Stanford, they compiled an index of quality of education. So you can see that most East Asian economies are at the top of the table, and also Switzerland, Sweden, UK, US, and European countries. And the countries that have the lowest quality of education are basically all developing countries. China is only an exception among all the developing countries that actually has a relatively high quality of education. Now, they actually showed that the best predictor of a country's long-term growth is the country's quality of basic education. We are talking about the basic education. Think about this. That's numeracy and literacy. Think about this. In your own work, the words, the language, the words, the vocab that you use today in your work are almost all learned when you are young, in your secondary school, primary school. And nobody uses calculus in their work, right? Or any high school math. Very few people actually have to deal with a math level that is higher than the 6th grade, I'm telling you, right? I guess that's the case, right? Okay, so they actually show that for every 1 point difference in the quality of basic education, so that the impact on economic growth, per capita GDP growth, is 2 percentage points. So China has a quality index that is like 2 points higher than South Africa and Peru, for that matter. So this factor alone can make China grow 4% faster than those two countries. That explains a big part of the puzzle. Where do they get this quality of education index? Just test scores. I mean, our European friends know this, the PISA score, right? So they actually use comparable international test scores to get this index of basic education. So you can see that I highlighted with the red ink, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Japan, Macau, Hong Kong, and mainland China all do very well in this regard, right? So that's the measure of quality of education. Of course, we all know, especially as Chinese, we all know that the Chinese can do tests very well, right? According to this former CEO of HP, so she was saying that I've been doing business in China for decades, and I will tell you that, yeah, the Chinese can take a test, but what they can do is innovate. They are not terribly imaginative, they are not entrepreneurial, they don't innovate, that is why they are stealing our intellectual property. I think there's some truth to it. There's some truth to it. But then, I think she somehow makes like a test-taking the opposite of like innovativeness, which of course is not true, right? Otherwise, I mean, in your companies, you will just kick out all those high test scorers, right? You don't want people from Tsinghua or Beidao. Those guys only know how to take tests, right? So you want to take people from Hangzhou Normal University, where Jack Ma graduated. So, and it's the second thing that she didn't fail to realize that. Of course, China has learned or imitate technologies from Western countries. Of course, that is what a developing country is supposed to do. But she fails to realize that it is not so easy to imitate other countries' technologies. If it's so easy, then every country would have been able to do so. So she should have asked, how come China has done so much better in terms of imitating other countries' technologies? Right? So that's a fundamental question. So of course, for a developing country, then you compare China's innovativeness versus Switzerland or the US. Of course, China cannot compare. But then for a developing country, the real question is whether your innovation capacity grows faster than those developed countries. If by that measure, of course, China has done very well, okay? And then China, of course, has mostly imitated, but that doesn't mean that China has no indigenous innovation. Still, because it is hard to copy and without any new idea. Think about this. When you copy and copy, you made a wrong copy, and that's innovation. That's innovation, right? So when you copy and copy, then you come up with a new idea. You might want to modify this existing technology a little bit to suit your situation. Then you have a true invention, right? So of course, so the two things actually go together. If you actually measure like innovation, invention, growth of patent applications, it's very clear that advanced economies like the US, Japan, are so much better than even a relatively high level middle income economies like Brazil and Mexico, right? So not to mention a lot of African countries, right? Nigeria is there are only a few hundred patent applications a year, right? So it's just no comparison. But then China is special. China started at just like any other developing country, but China now has the patent application numbers that is more than any other country in the world. So in a sense, China still is capable of invention. But of course, the quality of the invention is not very high compared to Switzerland, Sweden, Germany, or the US. But what is important is that the quality of China's patents has been improving. Then the growth in quantity is real. It's a real growth. So we are looking at the growth, right? Not just China. Korea has done well. India has done well. That's why they've grown faster than other countries. So look at scientific articles. Again, of course, that's a measure of inventions. Again, like the advanced economies do much better than all the developing countries. But China, again, is somewhat exceptional. And also there's indication that the quality of Chinese publications in international journals has been improving. It's already now above average. Now, so how do you achieve that technological progress? Normally people will say, that's because of government policy. The government has to spend money on R&D. If that's the reason, every country can do it. Just spend a little bit more money on R&D. Then your country can take off. Think about this. The world's average spending on R&D is only 2% of GDP. Most developing countries don't spend anything on R&D. And India, Latin America spend less than 1% of their money on R&D. It's not because they don't know, they don't want to spend on R&D. So this thing in economic terms is endogenous. It's not a policy measure. If it's a policy measure, then the UK should raise their spending on R&D. We can see that UK, Britain, has a much lower R&D expenditure to GDP ratio than Germany. But if you actually look at their per capita GDP growth, long-term growth rate, the UK beats Germany. So it's not how much you spend. It's not the money. It's not money. Now you can see, of course, China has increased R&D spending. But it's not the government spending. It's not government spending. It's endogenous. It's the spending by companies, entrepreneurs, multinational companies, and some of it are of course, from the government. So it's not the matter of money, yeah. So if it's the matter of money, you raise it to 3%, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. So to summarize, so China's rapid long-term growth in per capita GDP has been contributed by a faster accumulation of physical capital due to higher savings than all other developing countries. And also China has a relatively higher quality of education, basic education, that has made China more capable in absorbing existing Western technologies, and in the meantime developing indigenous innovation capacity, leading to faster economic and technological catch-up. So the real conclusion is this: China's comparative strength, or the differentiating factor in economic development, is more cultural, in the sense of savings and emphasis on education, than political or tactical. That means strategic. Now, then if that's the case, so why has China slowed down so much? Well, in order to understand this, we then have to use the Keynesian framework of consumption, investment, and exports, because it's a short-term economic fluctuation. It's not that China doesn't have the capacity to grow faster. There's a lack of demand. Consumption, investment, and exports. Now, so which factor has contributed the most to China's slowdown? So you have to remember, because we have a short memory, we must remember China's slowdown started long before COVID. China only had one bad year compared to the rest of the world in 2022. Otherwise, China is no worse than other countries. But before COVID, China already started to slow down significantly. Of course, you don't want to trust this number that much. But anyway, so you look at the consumption growth in China before the slowdown, before 2018, was always higher, significantly higher than GDP growth rate. That means the GDP growth in China was not slowed down by consumption, but either by exports or investment. But exports did not just go down, it fluctuated. So the only consistent decline is the investment rate. Think about this. Only in 2013, China's investment rate growth was 18% a year. And in a short 4-year period of time, 4 years, in 2017, the investment growth in China fell to almost 0%. That's a huge decline. So we can say that China's decline in slowdown in economic growth before COVID was almost entirely due to the significant fall in the investment rate. Then you ask, why is that? To me, I think it's policy choices. China had for a long time tried to transition from an investment-driven growth model to a consumption-driven growth model. So almost all the policies were not friendly to investment. Because when you try to lower the investment rate and increase the consumption rate, of course your policies are not friendly to investment. But that policy was based on the misapplication of the Keynesian model, a short-term model, to long-term economic growth. For long-term economic growth, consumption cannot drive there's no consumption-driven growth model in any economics textbook, any respectable textbook. No consumption can drive a country to grow. Otherwise, all countries would have been rich. That's the idea. Okay, so when you try to pull down investment, then the economy will slow down. As a result, consumption growth will also slow down. You can see that so consumption growth was pulled down by economic growth to a lower level even in 2019. So that's, in a sense, is a policy mistake to my mind. So in a sense, China could have grown faster pre-COVID. Okay? So I don't have time to talk about more about this issue, but it's in my book, either in the Chinese book, Catching Up to America. I also have either in my English book, Catching Up to America. I also have a Chinese book called Chinese Growth, 中国式增长, China-style growth. Okay, I address that issue, why China slowed down. So what about the geopolitics? Well, if you look at it doesn't bear anything on the data. If you actually look at the data, the China's trade with the US, of course, went down in 2019 because of the trade war, but then sharply rose in 2020 and 2021, and also in 2022, it didn't go down. And what about Europe? China's trade with Europe also sharply went up. I guess York also mentioned about this, both exports and imports. So China benefited hugely from the export sector in 2021 and 2022. Remember, China's growth of exports in 2022 was more than 10% a year, and the growth rate was only 3%. So we cannot blame the overseas markets for China's slowdown, right? So then what's the impact of geopolitics? To me, it's more symbols, it's more cheap talk than reality. Because it is very hard to decouple, for China to decouple with the world, and also for the world to decouple with China. In fact, China's reliance on foreign markets in terms of exports has been going down over the past 16 years. So China reached the highest level of export dependency in 2006, when China's export to GDP ratio was more than 36%. Nowadays, it's 18%. So China's reliance on exports has reduced by half. And that's, of course, it's the second lowest level than the US. The US reliance on exports is the lowest. It's understandable because it's the biggest, the US economy is the biggest market, Chinese economy is the second biggest market. Yeah. So, again, in terms of FDI, so the decoupling in a sense started a long time ago. From 2005, China's FDI inflow as a percent of GDP is only 1% of our GDP. So there's no worry, so it's not an issue of worrying about like foreign companies moving out of China. It's already only 1%. Where are you going? So the conclusion is this. So fluctuation may be inevitable, and the growth can be slowed down somewhat by geopolitics or policy mistakes. But as long as China stays the course of market reform and opening up, or at least does not significantly reverse market reforms, then the country can still achieve a relatively high long-term growth rate, averaging about 5% a year in the next 10 to 20 years. Thank you very much.